On behalf of the Institute of English Studies and as its director, welcome. Before we get this evening, a couple of housekeeping comments. Can I ask you all to turn to your speaker view? We're not on a webinar, we're actually on a kind of meeting on Zoom. So you'll get the best viewer experience if you turn to speaker view rather than having all of these little panels. We will show you all each other later, and I'm so tempted to wave at so many of you that it's probably best that we don't do that. So while you switch to speaker view, you will be muted for most of this event. If you have some questions or observations to make, particularly to Patience Agbabi after her reading, that you've put them in the chat, and our brilliant events and comms officer, Eleanor Hardy, will pick up the questions and feed them back. Okay, I'm going to get going and tell you a little bit about the Institute of English Studies. So the Institute, as everybody knows, has a national remit to support research in English studies and a long-standing commitment to the history of the book, from the medieval manuscript to the digital object, as well as the history of publishing and reading, writers and their work. And in many ways, the life and work of Keith Sambrook, who was an associate fellow in the Institute, represents the best of this work. An innovative and exciting publisher, he is known worldwide for his work on the African Writers series for Heinemann Educational Books. And I think for a few more days, you can still catch on BBC iPlayer the programme Africa Turns the Page, presented by David Olusoga, that features the African Writer series. And it's well worth viewing, not least for its clips of some of the most amazing writers of the last 20, 30, 40 years, Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o included. In the Institute, Keith Sambrook is also remembered as a teacher, happy to share his knowledge of the publishing industry, and someone who generously donated his fees to fund student bursaries and activities. Tonight, we celebrate Keith's work by relaunching the Sambrook Fund, as it was known, as the Sambrook Appeal. I'd like to thank Katie Sambrook, Keith's daughter, who is no mean expert in books herself, for her support and endorsement of this initiative. And I believe and hope that Keith's sister may also be on this call tonight. We will shortly hear from one of the recipients of Keith's generosity, Shira Buchsbaum, a recent graduate of the MA in the history of the book, or student of the history of the book. But I also want to acknowledge Dia Gupta, outgoing IES Post-Doctoral Fellow, who is moving to a 2-year funded fellowship at the Institute of Historical Research and the Royal Historical Society to work on race and equality initiatives, as well as her own research. We're sorry to lose you, Dia, though happy it is only to another institute in the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. With more secure funding, we can better support students and fellows like Shira and Dia, fulfilling our commitment to the next generation of researchers, teachers, and writers. At the end of tonight's event, we will also hear from Sarah Pyke, the Institute's incoming postdoctoral fellow on diversity and inclusion in English studies, whose work is funded by the University of London Convocation Trust. Sarah's background in oral history, living libraries, and children's literature will help us understand the many stories, some forgotten, some not, of those associated with the Institute, like Keith Sambrook, as well as the changing nature of English studies as a discipline now. And with that said, I'd like to turn to Shira first to say a few words. Thank you, Shira.
Thank you so much, Claire. I discovered the Institute of English Studies in applying for the Marshall Scholarship. And by chance, I met Andrew Nash and Chris Adams at the Boston International Antiquarian Book Fair in the autumn of my final year of university. My conversation with them ensured to me that applying to IES was more than a worthwhile endeavor. And I applied because the MA History of the Book course offered a broad foundation for subjects in book history, which I felt was a good first step in solidifying my research interests as I began my postgraduate education. I was also able to visit IES and meet Cynthia Johnston and Elizabeth Savage in January 2019, and I was struck by how generous they were with their time. Cynthia took me on an impromptu tour of Mags and Jarndyce, which demonstrated to me the type of attention I would receive as a student in the program. I so appreciate the lengths to which IES and our faculty went to encourage camaraderie among our students and the availability of the faculty to meet to discuss papers and research ideas. The pandemic aside, this year was quite difficult for me and my family personally, and the faculty were extraordinarily understanding and supportive of my circumstances, making the program not a burden, but a joy to complete. In researching scholarship awards, I came across the Sambrook Fund and immediately applied. As a full-time international student, the Sambrook Fund studentship covered half of my tuition, significantly defraying the cost of moving to and living in London. Living in London is an extraordinary experience and one that I cherish, but it is immensely expensive, and the scholarship allowed me to dedicate more of my resources to living in relatively affordable housing just a few neighborhoods from Senate House. In the before times, as I've taken to calling the period prior to the pandemic, I walked to Senate House every day, a luxury that allowed me to enjoy this magnificent city and one that I don't take for granted. I'm immensely grateful for the award and the affordances it gave me, especially in allowing me to enjoy the city in quite a unique way for a young graduate student. Thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Claire.
Thank you, Shira. I should point out that Shira has only just returned from the US to London, and she's currently self-isolating in a friend's flat. So welcome back, Shira. It's great to see you. Okay. In his obituary for Keith Sambrook, James Curry, who I hope is also with us tonight, quoted from a letter by the great Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o that he wrote learning about the death of Keith. And the quotes, and I quote, "I have always associated my becoming a writer with Keith Sambrook. Not only me, he had a similar impact on many African writers. Africa needed this literature to heal the wounds wrought on the continent by a century of colonialism. The African Writers series contributed to the soaring of the soul of a free continent, and Keith Sambrook was part of it." So thinking how to honour Keith's legacy and that soaring soul now in the UK, Patience Agbabi came immediately to mind. Patience is a distinguished poet and writer whose work has a wide reach in terms of histories and audiences. With her ear for the voices and music of the spoken word, she brought Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to new audiences with her somewhat cheekily entitled Telling Tales. And she brings her humour, dazzling wordplay, and interest in time travels to her most recent book, The Infinite. And we're going to hear from that shortly. Patience has just reminded me, and to my shame, that in scripting my introduction, I forgot her contributions to Refugee Tales, which is a series of engagements between writers and refugees over the last 3 years. And that's been a really important initiative. To return to Keith very, very briefly then, Keith's known and associated with the publication of Ngugi's famous novel about the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, Weep Not Child, in 1964. And I think, though you can't quite see it, Patience tells me she's put some of her African Writer series novels on the shelves behind her. Weep Not Child, the title is taken from Walt Whitman, an example of the breadth of literary engagement of this writer. And its hero is a young boy, Njoroge. Patience The Infinite, in 2020, published in April, features the palindromic L. I love that, actually. This is writing to delight a literary scholar. Elle is a 12-year-old girl and neurodiverse time traveller whose love of wordplay, perhaps like her authors, is delighting adult and young adult audiences alike. Patience's writing offers us the best of British writing today and the best of Black British writing. And in her hero, Elle, we glimpse future diverse story worlds. And, as we shall hear, a brilliant premise for leap years. I also like that this book started life as a proposal for a PhD. So in many ways, Patience is a great choice to celebrate and think about Keith's legacy. So as I've already mentioned, there'll be time for questions later, but Patience, can we start with a reading?
Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Claire, and to be reminded just of the breadth and depth and inspiration that I had from the African Writer series, which I first encountered in the late 80s after a university degree, where for a year I only read African authors to kind of redress the balance of having a very Oxbridge English literature degree, which was amazing, but I needed something else, and the African Writer series gave me that something else to sort of establish myself or feel that I could even be a writer in the world. So I'd like to share some extracts from The Infinite, which, as Claire said, began as a PhD proposal, which was really trying to sort of, I suppose, celebrate the voice of a young autistic girl. I felt it was a voice that hadn't been represented in literature before, especially a Black autistic girl. So that was my original proposal. But then the time travel came in through Elle's obsessions, one of which is leap years, because Elle is a leapling born on the 29th of February. And in my book, I decided to sort of, it really came from the wordplay of the word leap. I decided to have the leapling actually be able to physically leap through time. So I'm going to begin with the very opening of the book, where Elle is she's in school, and I won't give any more away. I'll just read the opening section. Chapter 0100, Elle. Something bad just happened, and I want to leap back in time to make it unhappen. But you're not supposed to solo leap to your 3 leap, which is 12 years old for annuals. I won't be 3 leap until the 29th of February, 3 days' time. I just ran out of double geography, and now I'm in the corridor. I'm tongue-tied, and my face is burning red with humiliation, and I can still hear Mr. Carter's old creaky voice in my memory. Elle, where are you going? I check my watch. 15:01, Wednesday, 26th of February. I close my eyes to block out the muffled shouts from the classroom, the yellow walls of the corridor, the smell of sweat, and all the bad thoughts colliding in my head about the bad thing that happened and getting into trouble for running out of a lesson. I'm thinking about leaping back in time so the bad thing won't happen. I don't mean to leap. That would be wrong. When I have that thought, another one comes into my mind at the same time. Will the athletics club still be on tonight? It's usually 5 o'clock on a Wednesday, but someone said it might be cancelled. I imagine doing running round the track to keep myself calm, and it feels like it's actually happening. My body goes fizzy, charged up like a battery. Something very strange is happening to me. My body isn't any bigger, but it's much stronger. I'm no longer Elle. I'm Elle to the power of 3. My head begins to spin so fast, I stop thinking about running. I try to think about nothing at all, but I've never felt so happy, like I could take on the whole world. I clasp my hands tight. Everything goes dark. I hear a door open. Classroom chatter pours out like a tidal wave. I open my eyes. Things slowly come into focus, like my eyes are a camera. I'm sitting on the grass by the school track, next to the long jump pit. My watch says 1700. My mouth is a capital O. I just leapt 1 hour, 59 minutes into the future. I feel dizzy, like I've been put in the spin dryer at the laundrette and my skin's still damp. When I try to move, I throw up all over the grass. But it doesn't make me sad. It makes me feel better. I look around me. No one's doing slow jog or high knees. No one's spinning in the discus circle. Athletics really is off tonight. So, nobody saw me appear out of thin air. Nobody saw me leap from the corridor. Only you and I know what just happened. I'm tongue-tied with everyone, except you. It's easier talking to you because I don't know what you look like, or if your eyes are rolling clockwise or anti-clockwise because I said something odd or rude like, "How many days have you suffered from acne?" I'm autistic, so sometimes I'm very direct, or say the wrong thing at the wrong time. But I love words, the sound and shape of them and how they feel on my tongue. And I love sprinting and long jump because it's the closest you get to flying. And when I talk about sprinting and long jump, it's like the words come to life and I'm pounding down the runway, launching myself into the air. It's the best thing ever. I like it here beside the track. If I was a millionaire, I'd build my house right here. How fast can you run the 100 meters? My PB is 13.12 seconds, which gives me an 89.59% age grade. That means I'm almost in the top 10% in the world for 11-year-olds. I want to run in the Olympics and stand a good chance because I'm a leapling with the gift, and the Olympics only happen in a leap year. Okay, so that was the very, very opening of the book, and you kind of find out in chapter 2 what the bad thing was that happened. Elle has received a mysterious text from the future, and she eventually travels to 2048 to find out what's actually going on a school trip, because she attends a school called Intercalary International, which where everybody there has the ability to leap through time, or almost everybody. I'd like to introduce another character from the book, because, as I say, this was very much about voices. It was about representation. It was about, at times, capturing the gritty vernacular of 21st century Britain. And I couldn't resist, as a poet at heart, writing a novel, I decided to have one of the characters would actually at times speak in rhyme. So I'm going to introduce the beginning of chapter 0300, MC squared. At the beginning of 7th year, a criminal came to our school. He was a skinny black boy with clumps of hair sticking out of his head like antennae. His eyes turned up at the edges, and he had an infinity tattoo on his left hand, which looked like a number 8 sideways. He wasn't in school uniform because he was a criminal, so his trousers and top were white with graffiti all over them. I tried to read what it said, but it gave me a headache. His name was MC Squared, the boy we'd see months later in the Time Squad video, but we didn't know that at the time. Mrs. Siekler had given us investigative homework on MC Squared the night before, so we could ask sensible questions. She gave us a secret link and reminded us of our oath of secrecy. That's when I found out he was a leapling who committed lots of anachronisms. Normal bad people commit crimes in their own time, but bad leaplings steal things or kill people in the past, so it's harder to trace the crime. All these crimes are called anachronisms. MC Squared was nicknamed the mixer of chronology, but I didn't have time to find out what it meant because Grandma wanted me to fetch the comb and pomade. Mrs. Siekler smelled of perfume that day rather than pear soap. She had her ginger hair down to her shoulders rather than piled up on her head, as usual, and was wearing bright blue eyeshadow. I didn't like this. I kept thinking she was someone else who'd stolen Mrs. Siekler's voice. Now 7th year, we are extremely lucky today. She was pacing up and down rather than standing still, which was really distracting. We have a very special visitor. I think I zoned out during her introduction, but the next thing I knew, everyone was cheering like he was a pop star. MC Squared blinked all the time. He blinked so fast you might not even notice. I think he was scared. I tried to hate him because he'd broken the law, but I felt bad for him because he was scared. And he spoke in rhyme, so it was more like a rap than a talk. To the power of 2, I deliver my apology. I committed intricate crimes against chronology. That word again, chronology. I now know it means the order that things happen. MC Squared was nicknamed the mixer of chronology because he sold things that were out of time, like DJs who used to mash up records. So the words came out backwards and sounded like another language, but I didn't know that last year. The making of watches and clocks is horology. I stole the past so the present acknowledged me. And I remembered reading online, he became an expert on clocks and watches. He would go back in time to find a clock that was worth lots of money and then bring it back to the present to sell it. Then he did the opposite. He stole modern watches and sold them to rich people in the past. He didn't make as much money that way round, but liked to watch people do big eyes in 1800. The wristwatch hadn't been invented yet. If you're in a mess, if you're in distress, send an SOS via SMS. Lots more applause. And Mrs. Siekla was smiling from east to west. Thank you, MC Spared, for that wonderful presentation. 7th year have looked you up online, so I'm sure they have lots of questions to ask you. But before they do, could you tell us the story of your name? Yeah. He disappeared, reappeared on the spot, his whole body blinking. Big Ben whooped, the whole class started muttering in amazement, and my eyes went too big for my head. It was like leaping for a split second. How did he do it? When I was a kid, he said, I leapt before I could walk, for real. Too much energy with no place to go. Doc said ADHD and prescribed medication, but the meds didn't work, so I got sent specialist school to help me. One of my peer mentors said, you're a bomb ready to blast, Spar. Channel that energy, you'll go far. I put my energy into rhyme. When I started rapping, I leapt all over the stage, here, there, everywhere. There was this brother called himself Einstein, after the genius professor that hatched nuclear energy. Einstein said, you ain't just MC, you're MC squared. He didn't just mean a rapping MC. He named me after the formula E equals MC squared. E's energy, M's mass, C's the speed of light. The most hyper MC on the planet. Okay, so you had a little bit of MC Squared, who's some people's favourite character. They love him, and I love him too. I love all my characters, even the baddies. Yeah, I mean, another important thing for me writing this book was to have some Nigerian representation. I mean, Elle's like a British-born Nigerian like myself, and she's Izon originally like myself. But I wanted to represent a Nigerian, to use Diran Adebayo's phrase. To mean like a Nigerian who's born in Nigeria, like a proper traditional Nigerian. So Elle is raised by her grandma. And in this particular scene, Elle is at home from school after the day after the bad thing that happened. And there's knocking on the door, and Elle doesn't want to answer it because she's scared she's going to get into trouble. But her grandma has other ideas. I think about ignoring the door, but grandma shouts from the bedroom, Elle, answer the door. Answer it all. I'm expecting the pastor. The pastor sometimes comes to pray over grandma's leg to make the pain go away. But it may not be the pastor. It could be the leap police who come to arrest me for my illegal leap. Elle, rise from this your table before my ears buzz. Please, I beg. Even if it's the police, I have to go downstairs and answer the door. But it isn't the police with steel handcuffs or the pastor smelling of palm oil. It's Mrs. C. Eckler. Can I come in, Elle? She says. I don't know why she's asking, as she's already walking up the stairs and entering our flat. I close the door and take a deep breath. Either she's come to exclude me for running out of class without time-out permission, or for running away from her car. Time-out permission is when I'm allowed to leave class to do running round the track. I couldn't ask for time-out permission yesterday because my voice stopped working and my legs wanted to run home rather than run round the track, but I ended up leaping instead. I hope she doesn't know about that. She's looking around the room, and I feel ashamed of the dank patch that grows mushrooms on the wall behind the television. The mushrooms are grey and look like ears you've scrunched up in your hands. I don't know what kind of mushrooms they are, but I bet they have a long name in Latin, and if you eat them, you'll die. Even though I cut them down and scrub the patch every Saturday, they never really go away. Mrs. Siekla is turning her head, looking like she's lost something. Is your grandmother here? I point towards the bedroom door, and at the same time, Grandma says, Elle, who is here? I open the bedroom door, and Mrs. Eckler follows me into the bedroom. I'm not happy. No one gave her permission to enter the bedroom. Does she think she owns the flat? But Grandma is sitting up in bed, now wearing her yellow and blue fish head tie and smiling. Mrs. Eckler, you are welcome. Please, take a seat. Grandma missed out the C, but I don't think Mrs. C. Eckler is offended. No one knows what the C stands for. Some people think it's Carol, but I have a better idea. I think it stands for 100 because C is 100 in Roman numerals. I don't know why Grandma is pleased to see Mrs. C. Eckler. I'm about to be excluded from Intercalary International. Grandma extends her hand to Mrs. C. Eckler and says, I am very pleased with the progress Elle is making in her PPF. I'm a level 4, which is almost the equivalent of GCSE level, exceptional for a 7th year. I'm pleased Grandma is pleased, but I don't think she knows what PPF really is. Grandma never learnt to read and write. Even though she can't read herself and does know what it's about, she won't let me read Harry Potter because now full of witchcraft. She doesn't understand there are good witchcrafts and bad witchcrafts. Harry Potter is about good overcoming evil. Yes, Mrs. Ifie, we are very proud of Elle. She is a clever girl, but... She pauses, and I hold my breath. I know what she's going to say. Elle has been bullied by one of the other children. We take bullying very seriously at Intercalary International. My mouth falls open into a capital O for oops. This is not what I was expecting. Even though it's a good surprise, I still find it difficult to cope with the change. If I was talking, this would make me tongue-tied. But as I'm already tongue-tied, my heart beats fast like it wants to jump out of my chest. For a moment, I feel so panicked, I wish Mrs. C. Eckler had excluded me. Big Ben says oops is like when you drive your car 5 miles down a narrow country lane, then suddenly have to reverse because a tractor's coming from the opposite direction. Reversing back to the junction's much harder than driving forwards. You could turn the steering wheel the wrong way and end up in a ditch. Grandma is now sitting up in bed, but I can tell she's in a lot of pain because her eyes are still scrunched like she's just woken up. She looks at Mrs. C. Eckler, then at me. On the 7th day, God took rest, not the 4th. Her eyes go big as Jupiter. Elle, why are you not in school? Mrs. C. Eckler speaks quickly. Elle has been granted some time off while we deal with the bullying. Mrs. C. Eckler is lying. No one gave me permission to stay off school, but I'm still not talking, so I don't say anything. Grandma doesn't understand bullying. At the age of 12, she had left school and was looking after her younger brothers and sisters in the village in Nigeria. But she always wished she'd studied longer so she could read and write. She worships teachers almost as much as God. If Mrs. C. Eckler says I can stay at home, then Grandma is happy. She smiles from her bed. Elle, make this your teacher a cup of tea. Thank you.
Thank you, Patience. This is one of these strange moments in a Zoom event where we can't give you a round of applause. But thank you so much for that reading. We've got some time now to do some conversation between us that I very much look forward to. And I really appreciate the characters that you picked out there. I personally love Mrs. C. Eckler. I just enjoy saying her name. And naming is incredibly important in this novel, isn't it? In this fiction. I have to say, I mean, Big Ben, it took me a while to clock who Big Ben was named for. GMT was a bit faster, Greenwich Mean Time. Many of the names are either palindromes or refer to features of time. And of course, in the passage you just last read from the scene with Grandma, Elle is taking PPF, which is her almost GCSE in past, present and future, which is just great. Can you talk a little bit about time and what you were thinking about with characters' names and time as you were putting this together?
Yeah, I mean, it came very early actually in the PhD application where I just became kind of obsessed with palindromes, and Noon Noon is a minor character in the novel, but that was quite an important one because I think at that stage I suddenly thought I had L already, but I liked the idea of the palindrome, I think, sowed the seeds of the time travel, because in the PhD application, there was no time travel at all. That came a lot later, where my obsession just developed and steamrolled. But yes, it all sprung from the words, from the language, actually. The whole plot just came from the words, from the idea of L, being a palindrome, reading the same way backwards as forwards, the idea of maybe being able to move forwards and backwards in time. And then suddenly getting all these ideas for other characters. Big Ben was a bit of a gift, to be honest, because I already envisaged this very sort of lanky white boy who's he's actually of Polish extraction, which came later. But I could see Big Ben, and I love that his name is Big Ben, and of course he's also obsessed with timing things. He's more a sort of more the autistic mathematician kind of genius guy that people are maybe more familiar with. It's very important for me to have an autistic girl who's very, very into language, because of course autistic people are into as many things as non-autistic people are. It's just very interesting. People tend to get stuck on this idea that they're all very mathsy or sciencey. So yes, Big Ben was important. GMT was important. MC squared is, of course, slightly different, more sort of mathsy than anything. But once I had the idea of having a rapper, of course, the idea of an MC who's a larger-than-life MC who can, disappear and reappear on the spot. So it all began with the characters, really. I had no idea what would happen at all. It just totally began with the characters. And then once I decided on Leap, well, the athletics came in also, because and let's be honest, a lot of these obsessions of L's are my own. Clearly, language, athletics, Olympics happening in a leap year, and that made me think. Literally, the word leap made me think of Bob Beeman's phenomenal 1968 long jump at the Mexico Olympics, and even at the time, there's an amazing quote by Lynn the Leap Davis. He was actually the 1964 British winner of the Olympic long jump, actually said something like he's leapt more than 50 years in time. Or there was some quote which suggested, and I again found that very interesting, the idea that if you achieve something phenomenal, it's almost like time travel in itself. So all those things kind of fed the novel, fed the idea. But as I said, it was very, very word and then character led.
I mean, thank you for delivering me back to the sheer pleasure and of my own obsession with words. I think it's a great thing, and it's something that you get a gift. There are gifts in amongst these characters, but the gift that you give us is very much the sheer fun of wordplay. I mean, there are times when I just laughed out loud as I caught up with where you were going, I think, as you riffed on various elements. And indeed, I just want to stay with Grandma a little bit longer, because she's the one that doesn't have that name. She's the grandmother. I'm quite intrigued by her. I'm sure you don't want to give anything away, but I suspect there is a follow-up book, isn't there? That I hear you've written. And don't say anything, don't give anything away. But I'm very keen to find out whether Grandma features in that as well.
Can I say, Grandma definitely does feature in book 2. In fact, there are hopefully going to be 4 books. I signed a 2-book deal, but at the time it was always very clear that it was a leap cycle. So the idea is that the first book happens in 2020 and the final book takes us to 2024. So
you definitely have to have the 4 books. Also, Grandma she represents time in a different way. She's the older woman in the group. I think that's quite interesting, or at least she is at the moment. We'll see. In that scene that you just read, Elle is hiding under the table, isn't she? That's one of her. If she's either running around, her mouth is running, or she's hiding, and that. I think that's a very comforting image. Can you talk about what the times when she hides?
Yeah, I mean, she had to come out from under the table to, extricate herself to actually answer the door, but she wasn't happy. I really wanted to. My original, my core idea. I'm quite glad I held on to that core idea, which was about showing somebody who really loves language, is in fact obsessed with language, but at times of extreme stress, finding it impossible to speak and being tongue-tied and needing to withdraw and needing to have that space. I'm not autistic myself, although I said previously I identify as somewhere, between neurotypical and autistic. And I have memories of growing up, and when I became very upset, I couldn't actually speak, and thinking, taking that one step further, you know, how would that be if you were autistic? You just couldn't speak, and yet you loved words. But somehow giving her voice when she's not speaking. So, you know, there are several points in the book where she's unable to speak, and yet, of course, you're having her inner voice coming at you. And I thought that was very empowering, actually.
She knows herself well, doesn't she? She has. I mean, that's your voice, or the authorial voice blending with hers. But she has a repertoire of strategies for coping, and I understand those. I get those. Sometimes you are overwhelmed with impressions, and one element of the time travel that you discussed, you mentioned in the reading from the first chapter, and this happens a lot, is that every time she leaps through time, she throws up, and then she gets a sweet. So it actually makes her physically sick. I mean, travel could make you sick. I think that's true.
Yeah, I think again, I think I put a lot of myself into the character. The whole thing is a first person narrative, and that I get incredibly car sick and train sick sometimes. So I could relate to that, but it's a very strong feature of autism to struggle with the senses. It's only been recognised since 2013 in the diagnostic criteria. Previously, it was anecdotal, but you know, about 2/3 of autistic people have some kind of sensory issue. And I have an autistic son, a 15-year-old son, and he used to have auditory issues where there were many noises he couldn't cope with at all as a very young child, which now he's able to cope with a lot better. So that was something I thought was very important to kind of talk about. And but at the same time, I always wanted that tension of showing somebody who both has very strong ability and disability, because the two often go together very closely. And I wanted to really show that, not shirk from the difficult side, the times where Elle doesn't do the right thing, or you know, mismanages herself, or doesn't have that amazing self-awareness, and other times when she's astonishingly mature and self-aware. I had to keep reminding myself she is 12 years old, but it is incredible how mature some 12-year-olds are.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. I also think there's a really interesting balance that you've created, because she can speak for so many of us, and she is a girl, black, and she's neurodiverse, she's autistic. So you've managed to create a character with, I think many of us could strongly identify with, and I'm sure some of the audiences that you've been reading this to don't even clock that. They're just very aware of the dynamism of this character that you've created. Sorry, please say.
Just to say, it's that sense about, it's, you know, seemingly a minority, but actually the humanity bypasses all that. It's totally. Like all those issues, you know, African writer series, we all enjoy them. It's not just written for African writers, although it's very important that it's written for African people, but it just shows this universality of human experience. And I think any book that does its job is able to cut across those, you know, class, race, gender, sexuality, all those things.
Yeah, I mean, the term that's perhaps sometimes overused here is inclusive, but I think you've done it through the telling of stories and the telling of tales, and the vividness with which you create characters. And as I keep saying, that they are all great fun. Can I step back from The Infinite? I'm not going to give away what The Infinite is, but I think with some of the puns that are going on here, to think about a couple of the other themes in the book. The book is very committed to an environmentalist ecological. This is an eco-futurist book as well. The plot to some extent revolves around meat eating. The world is divided into those who do and those who don't. So it feels very contemporary, even though it's projected into the future. And indeed, the epigraph for the novel is is very much important to this. So you quote from Greta Thunberg, don't you? Some people say that we are fighting for our future, but that is not true. We are not fighting for our future. We are fighting for everyone's future. Could you just talk about that a little bit? Respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think once I had the time travel element, I then had to think, well, you know, what am I going to go for? I'm going to go for far future, near future. And I thought near future was very important because I've read a lot of articles, mostly online, about, where we see ourselves going, and I've read, policy, and that idea that people say 2050 was a year that a lot of people were saying, oh, well, you need to do this by 2050, and suddenly people are saying, no, we need to do it by 2030. So you can't write a time travel book now and not think for near future. Actually, what impact? What will happen if they go to London? Will London be flooded? I mean, they don't actually, unfortunately, get to London, but that was one of the sort of proposed trips in the book for the school kids in 2048. So it necessitated that. Yes, it maybe began as an exploration of voice of an individual, but it actually, of course, you then place them in a world, in a larger environment, and you can't escape those issues. Those issues are just pressing and real, and they are very much part of the fabric of the plot.
I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience, if there are any, in a minute. I've got one final comment. I'm a medievalist, as many people on this call know, so I can't resist the asking Patience to talk a little bit about how her interest in the future is also derived from her interest in the past. And I suspect that some of her great kinship with words comes from earlier literatures. And indeed, she's known for her rap version of The Wife of Bath, for example, another great woman of literary history. Can you talk about how you leapt from telling tales to the infinite?
It's interesting. One or two academics have sort of even said that in a sense, telling tales as a form of time travel, in the kind of transported Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to the 21st century and recast it as a multicultural remix. For me, it was a wonderful stepping stone, really, to be working with the texture of Chaucer's Middle English vernacular. I was very, very interested with the idea of Middle English being this mixture of Norman French and Anglo-Saxon, and how he played around with that within Canterbury Tales. For example, the Pardoner's Tale, one of my favourites, where he has the Pardoner quote Latin, and even having L sometimes refer to Latin. It's a lot of writing when it boils down to it. We have these little sort of wordplay and linguistic things just creep in at every moment. But for me, the taking on board like a range of voices, a range of very much different kinds of voices, but within the poetic forms, strict poetic forms that I love using, meant that after that, I actually just had that real urge to work with character and story. And I was to be honest, at a crossroad. It's like, where do I go from here? Having sort of, in a sense, written a book of short stories in verse, what do I do next? And I'd wanted to write a novel for a very long time. I mean, we're talking about 15 years, but just hadn't had the courage. And suddenly I felt that I'd done my apprenticeship with telling tales. It felt like the apprenticeship for a novel. Not to say any art form is higher than the other at all, but just for me personally to feel confident to take on lots of different voices. And quite tellingly, when I wrote the first draft of The Infinite, it was almost all dialogue. It looked like a play script. It was about the voices, and then later on filled in the more the plot points and the descriptions of the scenes and so on. So,
do you think you have a play in you, or have you already written a play?
I've never written a play. Probably. It's not something, because I've got 2 more novels to write and 1 more to edit before this cycle's over. I'm not going to commit to anything for the next couple of years, but yes, I am very interested in language and both the embodied language, language out loud, internalized vocalizations, etc. So, yeah, I think I could probably do quite a good job if I put my mind to it.
One other question that I think is quite important here, and I raise it in the introduction, is the telling of others' tales now, refugee tales. Would you like to talk a little bit about how you tackled the voicing the story of a refugee?
Yeah, that was an incredibly important project. I mean, I'm really honoured to have been part of that. Each writer had to basically interview the refugee or asylum seeker or detainee. And so we actually had a record. It was all recorded, and then and we all said afterwards when we came together that we all felt almost like, oh my goodness, what do we do now? We felt almost unable at first to do anything with the material, because it's like, but this is their word. But the whole rationale behind the project was to have writers who would craft the words, because there are other projects where you record refugees' stories verbatim, and that's what you show and that's what you discuss. And this was very different. It was about the art as well as the original story, and it was about how, you know, people who work with language know, I suppose, how in a sense to manipulate the language and use it for a positive. And it was in direct antithesis to the press, who were using language to vilify, dehumanize refugees and asylum seekers. So yeah, it was a challenging process. But once I actually created a very formal poem, I wrote Corona, which, you know, a 15, well, in fact, Corona Redoublé, I think it's called, a 15 sonic Corona. The last line of one becomes the first line of the next, and so on. But I used as many phrases as possible from the original interview, and the Farida of the poem, and that isn't her real name, but when she first heard it, she said, "That is me," you know, that I'd captured her voice. And that was, I thought I'd done my job, because that was my job for that project, was to craft, but it was also to honour the original language, even as many of the idioms as possible of the original interview.
That's a great insight into honouring voices and honouring idioms. I think that's something that you really attend to in your writing, in all of your writing. I have a question about one from the audience about how close poetry, the sound of poetry, seems to be to in your fiction, and how the voice of the spoken word lends itself to poetry as well as to a more novelistic style. Could you talk a little bit about that for us?
Yes. What can I say? I think that's just how I write. I think whether I'm you know, writing poetry where maybe I'm more self-consciously aware of the sound, because I use rhyme a lot, and also the absolute full range of rhyme. And one of the things I love about medieval poetry is you know, things like, I don't know, some of the forms like Chaucer's Rime Royale, for example, and also hollow rhyme. Some of the French forms were really interesting. I love I rhymes, all those things. So I use a very broad range of rhyme in my poetry. And when it came to writing The Infinite, I just thought, you know what, if the only way I can write prose is this way. And a few years ago, an editor, I sent a poetry manuscript to an editor not at Canongate, and he said, "Have you thought about writing for children?" And I, at the time, I'll be honest, I was actually offended, because I wanted to be taken seriously as an adult poet. But now I can actually see he realised, because let's face it, children, it's about reading out loud. You know, when, you know, the middle, because this book is middle grade. It was submitted as YA, but it's eventually edited and marketed for middle grade, because it's a 12-year-old heroine, and middle grade is 8 to 12-year-olds. It's about, I've been into schools, I've read with children, you know, heard them reading, encouraged them to read, and it's about reading out loud as well as reading silently in your head. And so to be able to savour those words and enjoy the sound and the voicing of the words is as important as kind of hearing them silently in your head. So in that sense, I think I was in quite a good position to write a children's book. And yeah, where the sounds and the wordplay is supremely important. And I hope to give kids that sense of excitement about language, as well as enjoying the story and some of the politics behind it. I want them to just have fun with words.
I don't think you... I think your audience is an adult one as well. I don't think it's just a book for 12-year-olds or middle graders at all. I think nor do you talk down to you don't seem to have designed it for that at all, actually. I think in one of the things that your work does is actually deliver back to adults the pleasure of the spoken word. We don't do enough listening to each other's words, and I think that's a really important point. I'm struck by the fact that the idea for this came out of a proposal for a PhD that didn't get funded. I'm kind of interested in that. We are in this is the Sambrook Appeal. I'm trying to raise and hope that people will give freely and generously to support students and writers and researchers in the future. You spent many years as a poet, and that's not an easy living. You've now got a successful book on your hand, and hopefully you've got another one coming, and hopefully 2 more after that. So you're now in a position to earn a living from your writing. So in a strange sort of way, it worked for you not to do the PhD. Have you thought about that?
Yes.
What would your PhD be on now? If we could entice you back, what would your PhD be on now?
Oh, goodness. Well, the PhD would have finished in 2020. It would have started in 2017. And I was offered a place. It just, like, I didn't get the funding. But to be fair, the idea hadn't developed to the idea that it is now. And the idea now is a lot better. And I would have been very upset if this hadn't been accepted in terms of funding. Although you might argue at the time, I was established as a poet, and yes, you don't earn very much from royalties, but I'm quite known, and I've had some very, very good events the past sort of few years. I've been to the US quite a lot, for example, and so I've been okay, actually. I can't complain. So when I didn't get the funding, I was upset for about 10 minutes or something. Yes, I was disappointed for a little bit longer, and then I thought, you know what, I can do this. I can write this, and I can't remember what you said at the end.
so yeah, how about writing a PhD now? Would you ever consider that? Is that a phase of your life that's gone?
I think for me, it would have to be a creative PhD. I just love writing creatively so much. I think to write in a sort of more traditional. I know there are PhDs that are a bit more flamboyant. I recognise that, but I think for me, the idea of the PhD, it was more the idea of writing the novel than the PhD. It was the idea of being in an environment of learning and rigour and solidarity, and which I still enjoy, and I still go to universities and perform, and I love events like this because I'm bouncing off academics. I love it. So in a sense, I've sort of got that community in some ways anyway, and 1 or 2 people did say to me, do you actually need the PhD? And I sort of would. I'd love to have a PhD. Wouldn't we all love to have a PhD? My dad would be very happy.
I think Grandma in the Infinite would be very happy. At this point, we're drawing towards the end of our event. So at this point, I'd like to thank Patience very much and hand over to Sarah Pyke, who will give the formal thanks.
Well, first, let me say a huge thank you to Patience for that brilliant talk and reading. It's really nice to virtually meet you. It was wonderful to hear more from the Infinite, and I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on a copy. I was thinking while you were speaking how much as a word-obsessed, pattern-seeking child I would have loved this book. It's so playful and so attuned to words and language and so full of puns and humour. I absolutely love MC squared. And I also really like the way you've taken some of the tropes of that kind of classic 60s and 70s time slip fiction for children, but brought it into our climate crisis inflected present and future. I just know this is going to be a massive hit. It is with my child self, you know, thinking back to me as a reader. But it made me think too about Rudine Sims Bishop's much cited observation that for children, books can be mirrors, windows, or sliding doors. And it can sound horribly trite, but I think there is still truth in that, truth that's felt more keenly by those for whom the experience of finding yourself or seeing yourself in books is few and far between. And we do turn to books to see our experiences reflected and to see the world as it is, undistorted, and in order to enter other worlds and other perspectives. And all of those needs and desires are significant and should be met. But of course, it's not just the institution of literature in which children and adults deserve to see themselves. This should extend to all of our institutions, legal, political, medical, educational. And that's part of the reason that I'm so delighted to be joining the Institute of English Studies for the next year, to think more about the field of English as institution and as discipline, its histories and legacies and demands and possible futures, and how we're shaped by and might shape the structures we think, work and live within. Part of my remit, as Claire said, is to look into the history of the IES, and I can't wait to get into the archives and find out more about Keith Sambrook's extraordinary legacy, and hopefully uncover more stories from the IES's past that deserve wider attention. But I'm also aware that any archival history will also be a history of gaps and absences, and all of those people who leave no trace in the archives because their stories weren't deemed significant enough to feature or to preserve, or they had no chance of making their mark in the first place for reasons of race or gender or sexuality or class, ability or disability, mental or physical health, neurodivergence, age or anything else. I'm planning to balance my own archival work with a creation of a contemporary archive of oral histories of the Institute of English Studies, including past and present staff, fellows, students, and the wider community at Senate House. So that's cleaners and security staff and all the other people that make our working lives possible, particularly at the moment while the pandemic continues. I'll just end by saying that inclusivity and diversity are often seen as devalued buzzwords, as tokenistic, or as preserving the norms that they purport to challenge. Diversity in particular is often criticised as upholding a sense that there is an ideal, a kind of white, straight male ideal usually, to diversify from. And work on these issues and on decolonisation tends to land as a burden on some people more than others, often on people of colour and on women. Evidence of the resistance to change, or even acknowledging that these things are issues, is everywhere around us, and the structures that need dismantling have perhaps been made more than usually visible this year with the horrifying police brutality against Black people in the US and the UK. But I hope that by reflecting on our own experiences a bit more, we might both recognise our privileges where we have them, and also contribute to a future in which we can bring our whole complicated, messy human selves to whatever endeavour it is we are pursuing. It sounds like maybe we could all be a bit more like Elle or like Grandma. So thank you again, Patience. I really, really enjoyed this evening, but that's all from me. So I'll hand back to Claire to wrap up.
Thank you. Thank you, Patience. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Shira. Thank you, IES staff behind the scenes, Helen and Ellie in particular. Thank you to all our friends, fellows, staff, researchers and colleagues who have joined us tonight. I think we've made a great beginning. It's a beginning, and that's all it can be. But I think we've made a great beginning, and I hope, Patience, you'll stick with us as we look towards our future. So thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Goodbye.